Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening and welcome. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs here at the Chicago Council, and we're delighted to welcome Jonathan Tepperman here tonight. Just a few quick housekeeping points. We're on the record this evening. We welcome social media as always, but please silence your phones before we begin. We're also live streaming tonight's program. The Council organises over 200 events per year, which are all going to take place here in this new conference centre. Just some quick upcoming highlights. On October 6th is the official release of the 2016 Chicago Council Survey, which will take place at the Wilson Centre in DC in partnership with the Washington Post. We'll have Council President Ivo Daalder, Council Senior Fellow for Public Opinion Dina Smeltz, Wilson Centre President and CEO Jane Harmon, and the Hoover Institute's Research Fellow Corey Shack, along with Washington Post Jackson Deal. They'll be discussing America's next global priorities beyond the election. That program is obviously in DC, but it's live streamed and it'll be on at 9 a.m. Central Time. If you want to watch it, it'll be on the Council's website and the Wilson Centre's website. On October 27th will be the Chicago release of the survey. We'll have Ivo Daalder again and Dina Smeltz, along with Atlantic Council President Fred Kemp and University of Chicago politics professor Robert Pape. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, non-partisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. We convene leading global voices, conduct independent research, and engage the public in the discourse on critical global issues. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Turning back to this evening's programme, Jonathan will be in conversation with Council Senior Fellow Karen Weigert. I will then return to moderate the audience Q&A. Sorry, Karen will do the audience Q&A. But first, to introduce our speaker, please join me in welcoming founder and partner of Stafford Wells Wealth Management, Susan Templeton.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome, Jonathan. On behalf of the Council of Global Affairs, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Mr. Tepperman's book has received much positive attention in recent weeks. His central message, which is refreshing, is that through bold and pragmatic leadership, nations around the world have faced and overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles with smart policy fixes. This has resonated with Americans during this difficult election season. As we consider some of the dominant issues facing us here in the United States today, violence, social division, inequality, and terrorism, America's political leaders have often appeared too divided to respond effectively. In the tone of this presidential contest, as well as in Congress and local politics, there appears to be little willingness to cross the aisle to forge a bipartisan consensus on critical challenges. Mr. Tepperman's research, gathered from interviews with policymakers across the world, provides refreshing, revealing context to the prevailing political climate in the United States. He will discuss, for example, how Brazil's government massively reduced inequality, how Mexico's president brought together warring factions, and how Indonesia's leaders sidelined extremists. These inspiring stories of far-sighted leadership could provide instructive lessons for our leadership here in the United States. Before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker and moderator. Jonathan Tepperman is managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. He's interviewed dozens of world leaders, including Bashar al-Assad, Shinzo Abe, and let's just say the president of Brazil, because it's really hard to pronounce his name. He's also a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. Karen Weigert is Senior Fellow for Global Cities at the Council on Global Affairs and former Chief of Sustainability for the City of Chicago. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Tepperman and Karen Weigert.
Welcome, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to join you all tonight. And Jonathan, welcome to Chicago.
Thank you.
It is wonderful to have you, and as we just heard, this is an extraordinary time for our country. There are questions of division, there are challenges, there are fears, and in the middle of all that, you wrote a book. And I will say that I was struck that on the first page, literally of the introduction, you described it as a data-driven case for optimism. Is that what you intended to write?
I always feel like after an introduction that I've just received, the best thing that I could do is leave the room and go home, because there's nothing that I can do that won't undermine all these nice things that have just been said about me. Thank you to the council. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Karen. Thank all of you for coming out and giving up your Tuesday night to be here. I can't tell you how inspiring it is to see so many people here, and here because you care about these issues. To answer your question, yes, I did set out to write a good news book, a book of good news stories, as I write in the introduction. I did that for two reasons, because of a frustration and an intuition. The frustration is with my own profession. And what I'm talking about is the tendency of we in the media to focus almost unrelentingly on the bad news, to talk about problems, and to almost never focus on solutions. And this is both in cable news, in newspaper reporting and columns, but also in the literature of my field, the international relations, in which I've been reading for about 20 years. And when there's a lot of very, very good diagnosis of problems that goes on, and surprisingly little discussion of solutions and answers, let alone things that are working. And that's always really irritated me. Why exactly, I can't say. But it has, as an editor and a writer working on international affairs and frequently criticizing government policies, one of the ways I've always tried to keep myself honest is by saying, okay, Tepperman, if you think that they're doing a terrible job, how would you do things differently? And that's tough. But it has led me to start looking for answers where I can find them and to start collecting them. The intuition that I had was related, and it was that things are not as bad as everyone seems to think that they are today. We are constantly bombarded by bad news, and that has produced a sense of crushing pessimism in the United States and abroad, which is leading to all of these very negative trends. The rise of demagogic politicians who offer an alternative to the established way of doing things, even if their alternative is threatening and dangerous in many ways. It's led to the rise of things like xenophobia and nationalism, et cetera. I have long had this sense that things are not that bad. I understand why people are frightened right now, but I don't share that fear. But if you'd asked me 3 years ago to justify that intuition, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And so the way that this book came about was I said to myself, well, you edit a foreign policy magazine. Why don't you go around the world and start asking people if and how they've tackled their big economic and political problems? And what I found astonished me. It turns out that there are remarkable signs of progress all around the world on many of these global and national political and economic challenges, which so many countries have struggled with unsuccessfully for so long that many of us have concluded that the problems are unsolvable. And what I found is that that's not the case. Not only are there theoretical answers, there are answers that have been tried and have worked, and that offer hope and models for the rest of us. And so that's what I set out to describe in this book. I tell the story of how 10 different governments around the world, 9 countries, 1 city, have tackled or at least made enormous progress on 10 supposedly impossible political and economic challenges.
Yeah. In listening to you tell the stories, it really is what you said in the sense that it's about real people who can make real decisions. Right. And that adds an element of specificity to it that gives us all an opportunity to see how it could work. One of the stories you tell is about a challenge that we see in the polling data as being divisive, that has gathered a lot of national attention and international attention, and that's the question of immigration. And yet, you give us an example, just a little bit north of here, that has radically changed the way their country understands immigration. Can you tell us what happened in Canada?
Sure. It's no longer a shock to hear that Canada has gotten its immigration policy right. Canada has become widely admired in recent years, especially since the election of Justin Trudeau. And by the way, I have a personal stake in this. I am now a US and Canadian citizen, but I grew up in Canada. And the idea when I was growing up that Canada could be admired for anything would have seemed totally implausible for me. As a Canadian who spent a lot of time in the United States, I was used to being mocked for the fact that I was Canadian. And so the fact that Canada is now being held up as an example, and being Canadian is considered actually kind of cool, is still mind-blowing to me. So this is the world in which we live. This is the Canada of today. What fascinated me about the Canada story, well, let me backtrack and give you just a couple of statistics on what Canada is doing today and the immigration situation in Canada. Canada today has one of the highest per capita rates of immigration in the world. It's about double that of the United States. The percentage of foreign-born citizens of Canada is again about double that of the United States, even if you factor in undocumented people living in this country. And Canada admitted about 3 times more Syrian refugees in the last year than has the United States. 3 times more, despite the fact that Canada has 1/10 the population of the United States. And yet, if you ask Canadians how they feel about all this, they couldn't be happier. There's one country in the industrialized West that has suffered no backlash against immigration in recent years. Canada. There's one country that has no populist party or prominent populist politician today. Canada. If you ask Canadians what makes them proudest of their country, they rank multiculturalism, which has become a dirty word in most places, openly condemned by Angela Merkel and David Cameron. Canadians rank multiculturalism second, ahead of hockey, in terms of what makes them feel good about Canada. But the really interesting and inspiring part of the story for me, I discovered as I started to look into it, is that Canada wasn't always like this. In fact, in the 1950s, you could not have found a more parochial, white, and racist country. Canada had an explicitly racist immigration policy. They called it colloquially White Canada, and that tells you pretty much everything you need to know. That it was not a reference to the snow. Canada had 3 classes of immigrants. If you came from Northern Europe, you were welcomed. If you came from Southern Europe and had a little bit of pigment in your skin, you were let in grudgingly during intense manpower shortages. If you came from everywhere else, you didn't bother applying because Canada wasn't interested in you at all. So the question that preoccupied me is, how did that Canada become today's Canada? And the question, the answer is the short version of the answer is fairly simple. Canada in the mid-1960s dropped its racial criteria from its immigration policy entirely. It was the first country in the world to adopt a race-blind immigration policy. And in its place, it created a system that stressed the economic value, the economic contribution that immigrants could make to Canada above everything else. So they created a 9-issue rubric. They scored things like your ability to speak English and French, job skills, education, et cetera, and whether your skills met Canada's needs at the moment. If you scored above a certain number, you got in. If you didn't, you didn't, regardless of where you came from. Now, the reason Canada did this, I think, is fascinating. It had nothing to do with virtue. This is another part of the story that I really love. My Canadian mother, if you talk to her, will argue that Canadians are inherently better than people everywhere else in the world. They're simply nicer and more civilized. But the fact of the matter is, although she will dispute this, Canadians are no better. Canada changed because it had to. the problem that Canada faced in the 1960s with immigration was twofold. One, Canada had emerged from World War II as a leader of the global human rights movement. It had been very instrumental in the creation of the United Nations, and allied itself with countries that were throwing off colonialism and becoming independent. All of that made Canada maintaining a profoundly racist immigration policy increasingly awkward. But the real impetus came from something much more material. In the 1960s, Canada's economy was booming, but its preferred source for white workers, namely Europe, had just stopped exporting them because Europe had recovered from World War II, and so Brits, Germans, Italians, et cetera, were no longer seeking to move to Canada. So Canada had to open up. It had no choice. So Canada did it, but Canadians weren't happy about it. In the 1950s, Canada's leading liberal newspaper, the Toronto Star, in 1954, the same year that the US Supreme Court passed Brown versus Board of Education, published an editorial openly praising Canada's racist immigration policy. And in the 1960s, as the government was making these changes, 2/3 of Canadians thought that the country should continue excluding non-white immigrants and should not increase the overall numbers at all. So the government faced this second problem. How do you change people's minds? Well, in 1971, the prime minister at the time, who happened to be the father of the current prime minister, a guy named Pierre Trudeau, launched the world's first policy of official multiculturalism. He walked into Parliament and declared that from this point forward, there would be no single Canadian culture. Canada was not a bicultural country. It was not, until recently, or until the 1950s, Canada, despite the fact that a large proportion of its population was French, had considered itself, the dominant elite at least, a monocultural country because the French were excluded from power and influence. That started to change, but Trudeau said, we're not going to be bicultural either. We're going to be multiculturalism. We're going to be multicultural. And he launched a massive program of government support for multicultural initiatives that promoted the integration of new immigrants into Canadian society, but also sent this message, which the government repeated again and again through school curriculum and curricula, ethnic heritage days, commercials on television, that multiculturalism makes Canada more Canadian and not less. And that was a message that resonated particularly strongly in Canada because, as some of you may know, Canada's identity has always been somewhat nebulous and has been defined largely in opposition to the United States. But this policy, too, was not adopted because of idealism. It was because Trudeau had to solve a very different problem. And that was, in 1968, the year Trudeau was elected, Canada's long Cold War between its English and French speakers had just become a hot one. Quebec was threatening to secede. There was a violent separatist organization called the FLQ, the Front de Libération du Québec, that had started setting off bombs in Montreal. Canadians were actually killing other Canadians over politics. So Trudeau came into office and he had to do something about this. And his first attempt was to pass the Official Languages Act, which for the first time gave French equal standing with English in Canada. The Francophones loved it. The Anglophones weren't so crazy about it. But what Trudeau didn't anticipate was that there was a full third of the population who lived mostly in the Western provinces, who came from countries like Italy and Armenia, Eastern Europe. A lot of them were Jews, and they didn't consider them French or English. So they hated the new policy. And they represented about a third of the population, and they were a key Liberal Party support base. So Trudeau had to try again, hence the policy of multiculturalism. So these two progressive policies, neither of which were adopted for progressive reasons, were put in place and then quickly became mutually reinforcing. On the one hand, ordinary Canadians started to see the economic benefits of immigration all around them as these new immigrants started contributing to the Canadian economy. And at the same time, they started hearing and integrating this message that this diversity, this pluralism, was enhancing and strengthening rather than weakening the identity of the country. And it worked so well that, and this is a very long answer to a question, which I'm about to wrap up, in 2015, This anecdote is so good, I just have to share it. Molson Brewing, the largest beer company in Canada, decided to make its main advertising campaign all about multiculturalism. Try to imagine that happening in the United States. They did that with a commercial that looked like this. They would put mysterious beer fridges on Canadian streets that were locked. They would just suddenly appear one morning, and people on the street would approach them and try and open them. The door was locked, they couldn't do it. People figured out that there was a microphone with 6 red lights above the mic. So people started trying different phrases to get the fridge to unlock. Finally, somebody went up to it and said, "I'm a Canadian." And the first of the 6 lights went on. So people thought, oh, this is great. So people started saying other things about being Canadian. The light still didn't come on until someone else said, "Je suis Canadien." And the second red light went on. And it was only when they could get people to say, "I am Canadian," in 4 other languages, for a total of 6, that the fridge opened and everybody got free beer. Molson videoed this, and it was their main ad campaign for the summer. Nothing to do with babes in bikini, nothing to do with cars. That's Canada today.
That is not the conclusion I think I thought of when I started reading your book. I do appreciate drinks at events, and so I think that's a thoroughly appropriate way for us to dive into these topics, particularly in this challenging cycle that we're in this year.
Tonight was sponsored by Molson, by the way.
There,
right?
it should be. We'll have to remember that. International beer only. I'd love to dive into another topic that's been particularly challenging for many, many countries, and certainly that we are challenged with in the States, and that many people are concerned about. And it's really the question of Islamic fundamentalism. And it's viewed by many as a critical threat in the US based on our polling data. And yet, when you went looking for big challenges that had big solutions, you found one in this space. And not only that, you found it in the world's largest Muslim majority country at a time of tremendous turmoil. So Indonesia post-Suharto. Please tell us how this has happened and where they are today.
Right. So Indonesia, as you said, is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. It's also the 4th largest country in the world, about 200 million people. In 1999, Suharto, the long-standing dictator of Indonesia, was toppled through one of the great people power protest movements of the 20th century. But people, as exciting as that moment was, people worried that Indonesia was going to explode. The country is made up of 17,000 islands. People speak close to 1,000 languages. So in many ways, it didn't even seem to make sense as a country. And there were separatist tensions that immediately caught fire and broke out into open warfare. At the same time, Islamic and Islamist, radical Islamist parties, which had been suppressed reliably by Suharto for most of the 30 years of his tenure, became wildly popular as they were freed to politic for the first time. And in Indonesia's first free elections that year, they scored collectively about 36% of the vote. And so experts warned that either the country was going to explode or was going to adopt a tyrannical form of Islam and become like a new Iran in Southeast Asia. Fast forward to today, that hasn't happened. In fact, Indonesia is now a pretty successful democracy. Power in 2014 changed hands peacefully for the 4th time in 16 years. And the Islamist parties have steadily lost support in each of Indonesia's subsequent elections. And what's particularly interesting about that, and makes Indonesia such a good model, is that has happened at the same time that Indonesians have become more pious on a personal level. So what's fascinating about the Indonesia story to me is that Indonesia's success against extremism has nothing to do with secularism. Indonesia is not a secular country. There are 5 religions enshrined in the constitution. You have to declare faith in one of those 5. And Indonesians, however you measure them, are steadily becoming more and more religious. And yet their support for Sharia, their support for terrorism, their support for is dropping. Meanwhile, so that speaks to political Islam. The other problem Indonesia had was with Islamist terrorism. The problem was demonstrated most spectacularly in 2002 during the Bali bombing, which you all know about, when 200 people, many of them Americans and Australians, were killed at a nightclub in Bali by an organization known as Jamaah Islamiyah, which was made up of a lot of Afghanistan alumni with links to Al-Qaeda. Today, terrorism is almost unheard of in Indonesia. There was an attack on a Starbucks last year, but I think one person was killed. In other attacks in recent years, all of the victims have been policed, and the numbers are in the low tens. While people do worry about ISIS in Indonesia today, the number of Indonesians who have actually joined the organization is tiny. The best estimate is somewhere between 400 and 500 people, which means when you're dealing with a population of about 200 million people, that Indonesia has a far lower per capita contribution than Belgium, for example. So again, the question is, how did Indonesia do all that? And the answer is severalfold. First of all, Indonesia's 4 democratic leaders, its 4 post-Suharto leaders, all of whom were highly flawed, were all fiercely dedicated to democracy and to democratic values and working through the democratic processes. And what that did was send the message to ordinary Indonesians that democracy is an attractive alternative that can actually deliver dividends. The second thing that these presidents have done very successfully is co-opt many of the best parts of the Islamist agenda, notably anti-corruption and poverty alleviation, which especially during the years when the country was ruled by SBY, as he's known, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who left office in 2014. The country made great progress in both economic development and in lowering corruption, although it's still a big problem. They also invited Islamist parties into their governing coalitions. In fact, brought some of their leading politicians into their cabinets. Now, that horrified a lot of secular Indonesians, but what it did is 2 things. Number one, it deprived the Islamists of the rhetorical weapon that they're able to wield in countries like Egypt and throughout the Middle East, Jordan, where they're excluded from power, which is that we are the tribunes of the downtrodden because we ourselves are oppressed, and we are pure. And the other way that it proved to the Indonesian people that they were not so pure is because it got them mixed up with all of the grubby compromises involved with day-to-day politics. It showed that many of these politicians were actually not any good at governing, and the radical Islamists did their part by getting themselves involved in a number of very embarrassing scandals, including several years ago, the number 2 for the most hardline party was caught by anti-corruption police in a hotel room with a bag with about $1 million in cash and a naked girl. And the same year, another one of their parliamentarians was videotaped watching porn on his iPad in a session of parliament. So all of this did a great deal to weaken the appeal of these parties. At the same time, Indonesia was cracking down hard on terrorism, but Indonesia again did this in a very precise and even delicate way, with a dedication, a determination, I should say, not to reproduce, repeat the oppressive tactics that Suharto himself had used. So they created a new anti-terrorism task force, but they made it, they formed it out of the police, not out of the military, which had a very bad reputation for human rights abuses and was seen as the defender of the Suharto regime. They only detained suspects when they had enough evidence. They held public trials. What that did was, again, send the message that democracy is robust and can fight against terrorism. But it also helped convince ordinary Indonesians who until that point had tended to believe that the country didn't have a domestic problem with terrorism, that it really did. That because these guys, when they went on trial, didn't get up and say, my salary was paid by the Mossad or the CIA, which is what most people had assumed it by that point. But these were ordinary boys from the sticks who had become radicalized at home. And the last thing was that Indonesia treated these terrorists who it would capture not as unredeemables, but as good men gone astray, essentially. And so it launched a very successful de-radicalization program that involved sending liberal imams into prisons to try and convince these guys that terror is un-Islamic. The counterterrorism police would pray with the former terrorists. They would take their meals with them. If they agreed to abjure terrorism and denounce their former colleagues and inform on them, the state paid for their children's education. They would bring their fiancés in and pay for weddings. And then finally, the state launched a major PR campaign along similar lines to send similar messages to ordinary Indonesians. And this featured, again, liberal Islamic clerics from Indonesia and from the Middle East. They got pop stars involved. Several of the songs with this message of anti-extremism, believe it or not, made it to the top of the Indonesian pop charts. They had comic book artists involved. And all of this had a profound impact on public opinion.
When you think about the terrorism question, just this data on so little terrorism in Indonesia, it's something people around the world admire and look to. And you have another chapter in the book that is really rooted in terrorism, and it's the terrorism that we felt here in American soil that was so anchored in New York. And it's the one story you have that's not about a country, and it's actually about a city. And the city you chose was New York, and the opportunity was this backdrop of a changed world that the new Mayor Bloomberg inherited. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit, first about why a city, why can a city make it into this book, but what really did that city do on this global challenge?
So this chapter in New York City is about counterterrorism, but it's also about political gridlock. I have two chapters in the book that focus on gridlock because I felt like it was such an important problem, such a painful problem today, and because it's the font of so many other problems that we face in this country and that I write about in the book. These two chapters offer different models for how you tackle the problem. One, you can do what Mexico did in 2012 and actually end gridlock by bringing the warring political parties together and achieving cooperation and reform, or you can do what New York City did. When Bloomberg was elected 2 months after 9/11, he rapidly came to the conclusion that New York City couldn't count on the federal government to keep it safe. As the 9/11 Commission report revealed, the three-letter federal agencies, as they're known in the intelligence community, had made a long list of unforgivable errors in the months leading up to 9/11. Meanwhile, the Bush administration, which had come into office as the Harvard MBA administration, these were the guys who were supposed to be the technocrats who knew how to get stuff done, had completely ignored warnings from the Obama administration about this danger sweeping out of the Middle East. And so Bloomberg decided that he needed to function like a federal government on a municipal level. And that's why New York City features in the book, because it's the story of a city acting like a country. Rather than rely on the federal government, which has traditionally played the role of keeping cities safe from foreign threats, New York decided to do it domestically. So Mayor Bloomberg's first hire before he'd even become mayor was a new police chief, who was actually a former police chief of New York City, Ray Kelly, who had served as commissioner in '92 and then left and worked in the federal government. Bloomberg brought him back. And he and Kelly then set up what was effectively a national security agency on a municipal level. They created an intelligence directorate, which worked like the CIA, and they created a counterterrorism bureau, which worked like the Department of Homeland Security. And these two units quickly developed such incredible expertise that within a few years, the federal government, federal agencies were coming to New York to ask for New York City's help. Now, how did the city do this? Because, of course, its resources were nowhere near what the federal government's were. The CIA alone has a bigger budget than the entire NYPD. And New York City after 9/11 was going, remember, through an intense fiscal crisis. The city suffered a massive economic hit on 9/11 and in the months following. But what the Bloomberg administration did was start hiring the kind of people who had never worked for a city government before. So they created a brain trust within the NYPD of non-police officers, people with incredibly diverse backgrounds, former US Supreme Court clerks, people who had worked in federal government in lots of different ways, former bankers, many people who had no experience working in government, who were able to do analysis of foreign threats and to help the city understand the problem that it faced and that it wasn't hearing about from the federal government, which is notoriously bad at sharing classified information. One of the other things that New York City started doing was sending foreign officers abroad. Within a couple of years after 9/11, NYPD had officers stationed in 11 cities around the world. No other American city had ever done this before. The advantage of doing this was that these agents, they were officers, they were all cops, were able to go into local police forces in Scotland Yard, in London, in Madrid, in Berlin, in Abu Dhabi, and establish cop-to-cop relationships with the officers on the ground. Because, cops, whatever the language that they speak, all share a similar demeanor and language and code. And so they were able to establish personal relationships and intimate ones on the way that diplomats are not able to do. And this effort proved so successful that in 2005, when the London tube was bombed, New York City had its first reports within the hour and made changes to the New York City subway system security protocol within 24 hours. Another advantage that the city took, another asset, I should say, that the city took advantage of was the lack of red tape that exists on the municipal level. One of the things that had really hampered the federal government leading up to and then following 9/11 was its lack of foreign language expertise. The reason for that is because, as you know, having worked in the federal government, the vetting process for people throughout the government, but especially in intelligence agencies, is notoriously difficult. And if you have a close relative living in a foreign country, if you are a dual citizen, the chances of you getting clearance are almost nil. That's not an issue in New York City. The NYPD has historically welcomed immigrants. And after 9/11, Bloomberg and Kelly made this massive effort to bring in the members of New York's ethnic communities into the NYPD. And they did such a good job that within 2 years, they had 3 times as many Arabic speakers as the FBI would have 3 more years later. And by 2009, NYPD had 1,500 linguists and staff certified in 55 foreign languages. And so if the federal government needed to translate something in Fukienese or Dari or a dialect spoken in a Kurdish dialect spoken in Eastern Turkey, they would go to an NYPD for help because New York had the cops. And what these cops also brought was the cultural understanding and the street smarts that they had developed in most cases by growing up in these foreign countries.
It's an amazing story, and it fits, as you said, under your umbrella of gridlock. And I think as we look at this time in America's history, gridlock is a term we're familiar with, and solutions to gridlock we're less familiar with. And I'd love it if you would go back to that story you mentioned earlier of Mexico and just set the stage for the political divisiveness that existed there, the history that was sitting at the stage when a new president came in and literally changed the game.
So Mexico became a democracy in 2000. For the previous 71 years, Mexico had effectively been a one-party state ruled by the PRI, and although it had elections, the government put its thumb on the scales, so the opposition could never win. That changed in 2000, and for the first time, the opposition won the presidency. But rather than use their new freedoms to fight for reform, Mexico's three main political parties used them to fight one another. And Mexico's Congress immediately deadlocked, and over the next 12 years, they passed almost no effective legislation, and they did nothing to tackle Mexico's big pressing problems, such that those problems started to spiral out of control. Drugs, crime, corruption, etc. Things got so bad that in 2008, the Pentagon warned that Mexico risked collapse, that it could become a failed state on the United States southern border. And by 2012, the country was facing an existential crisis. Corruption was leaching away 10% of GDP every year. Monopolies were smothering the economy to the extent that one man's businesses, Carlos Slim's, accounted for 1/3 of the Mexican stock exchange, and his telephone company owned 80% of landlines in Mexico. Life expectancy was the lowest in the OECD. The country's critical oil sector, for which the government depends on 1/3 of its annual revenues, production had fallen 25% in the last decade due to lack of investment, and on and on and on. What that did was convince Mexico's three warring political parties that not only was their fighting destroying the country, but it also convinced them that their fighting was destroying their own chances at the polls. Because in 2000, the opposition PAN party, which had ruled for the preceding 12 years, was trounced. Their candidate that year got 25% of the vote, which was considered humiliation. And the PRI, which was associated with the bad old days, came back into power, but even the PRI only got 38% of the vote. So what this said to a number of the more sort of committed politicians within all three of Mexico's parties was that they needed to do something different, and that thing was to start cooperating. What they also realized was that Mexico's special interests had become so enormously powerful, whether it was the monopolies or the cartels, that no party was going to be able to take them on its own. They had to form a united front. So the president elected in 2012, the president to this day, was this guy named Enrique Peña Nieto. He was not an inspiring figure in 2012. He is even a less inspiring figure today. And the Trump visit was only the latest in a long string of fumbles and own goals and mistakes that he's made. He was so he seemed like a lightweight when he was campaigning in 2012. He was a notorious philanderer. He was married to a telenovela star. His own life seemed like a telenovela, such that Ashley Madison, which is that website for it's like Match.com for adulterers, ran a billboard in Mexico City during the campaign that showed Enrique Peña Nieto's picture, and it said, "Peña Nieto, great for Mexico, not so great for his family." So women would call him Bonbon, sweetie, at campaign rallies. And yet this Bonbon came into office determined to do things differently. And when days after he was elected, he was approached by a guy named Jesus Zambrano, who was a leader of one of the other parties, this was the left-leaning PRD, to float the idea of a deal. Peña immediately jumped on it. And they proceeded to launch a negotiating process, which continued over. Mexico has a very long period between its elections and the time the president is sworn in. It's about 3 or 4 months. So they started the negotiations immediately. Now, despite the crisis that I've just described, which provided ample motivation to tackle Mexico's problems, the process could easily still have failed because, crises countries face crises all the time. So it's not enough to say that that is in itself a solution to a problem. But Peña was extremely canny about the way that he managed these negotiations. And very briefly, what he did that was so decisive was, number one, he kept the meetings very small, just 3 representatives from each party, so a total of 9. And he kept them secret. They would meet every day in the home of one of the party leaders. They would share their meals. They would share tequila, and they would talk and they would talk and they would talk. That process alone started convincing or started changing the way these politicians saw each other. And I should say that in 2012, the bitterness that separated Mexico's 3 parties was every bit as intense as that which separates Democrats and Republicans in the United States today. And you were considered a traitor if you even talked or floated the idea of talking to the other parties, which is another reason that they kept things secret, because this allowed them to ward off pressure from special interests and also from the dead-enders in their own parties, of which there were many, including, by the way, President Calderon, who had just left office and was opposed to a deal. And then Peña was also very careful to sequence the plan that emerged in several ways. Number one, he put the issues on which everyone could agree first to build confidence, and then he staggered everything else, put other parties' priorities before his own, made big compromises in several cases, gave up key PRI priorities to adopt those of the PAN and the PRD. And what the sequencing did, as well as an agreement that nothing would be agreed until everything would agree, was convince the parties that nobody would get what they wanted unless they stuck together. And sure enough, that's what happened. When Peña was sworn in, he announced what became known as the Pact for Mexico. And over the next 18 months, Mexico's Congress passed one of the most far-reaching reforms and packages in Mexico's history. They broke open the monopolies, they liberalized the energy sector, they restructured Mexico's schools, they restructured Mexico's banking sector, they changed its tax laws, and on and on and on. 85 major reform measures passed with an average of 80% support in Congress, many of which had to be passed twice because they required a constitutional amendment and then enabling legislation. And while Mexico still has big problems today, some of these are not Peña Nieto and the current government's doing. They have as much to do with the global economic slowdown and the low price of oil, which is hurting Mexico very, very badly. And there's good reason to believe that once those global trends turn around, Mexico is primed for an economic explosion of the kind that it has not experienced in decades.
So you set out around the world to write this book on this data-driven case for optimism, and I'd like to ask you one more question before we pull the audience in. And the question is this: when you found all of these stories, they're impressive, each and every one, but they're actually more impressive as a group because you start to see these threads of pragmatism, these threads of taking advantage of a crisis. Tell us what you found when you looked at them as a group.
Sure. And this may get us into talking about what we're supposed to be talking about, which is advice for the next administration. What I decided to do with the conclusion of the book was to ask not just whether these particular answers to these particular stories could be replicated in other places, but whether there were larger lessons that could be drawn from them for countries, governments, leaders of all variety, struggling with a whole sort of different, or a whole long list of different kinds of problems. And I found that, in fact, yes, if, of course, all countries are specific. You can't simply take what worked in one place and expect it to work somewhere else. But if you learn the sort of and absorb the underlying lessons, those are broadly applicable. There are 5 in the book. You're going to have to buy the book to get all 5, but I'll go over the top 2 right now. The first is, I call it in the book, the power of promiscuous thinking. That's just a clever, or maybe not so clever, an attempt at being clever, way to describe pragmatism. All the leaders that I talk about in this book were relentless, unsentimental, even ruthless pragmatists. This meant that they never let things like party or ideology or philosophy get in the way of their search for answers. These were leaders who would start with a problem, look at the data, and then look everywhere they could for an answer, whether it was from different parties or different countries. And they would bring the answer home and try to make it work in their local context, and worry about things like party and philosophy and ideology after the fact. They always, made sure to serve their constituents, but often did it in unconventional ways. Now, that's not easy to do, and it takes a lot of guts. Some of the politicians that I profile in the book were very open about their pragmatism. Trudeau famously hung a banner saying "reason above passion" in the Prime Minister's residence in Ottawa. Lula was the former president of Brazil, was shameless about the fact that he appropriated the kernel of what would become his enormously successful anti-poverty and anti-inequality program, Bolsa Familia, from the opposition party, and made no bones about it. Lula was once challenged at an election rally by a member of the opposition who said, "Lula, you act like you made everything up, like you discovered Brazil. You didn't discover Brazil." And Lula said, "It's true, but only because I wasn't born at the time." So. And Lula and Trudeau profited from their pragmatism, but some of the other leaders didn't. In Mexico's case, all three of the political parties the political leaders faced major rebellions within their parties. And Peña, as you all know, is hardly thriving in the polls today. That's because big reforms, structural reforms, often take a long time to pay off. Which is why most politicians don't dare to attempt them, because the payoff may well not come while you're still in office. And so this gets to number two, which is guts, and a willingness to put country and the search for solutions before your own political standing, which is not to say that these leaders were not politicians, because they were. And another point that I want to emphasize is that in no case was it enough to just get the technocratic fix right. All of these leaders were shrewd politicians and were very careful to figure out how to manipulate the political process as well as the policy-making process. Because certainly in a democracy, if you don't do the one, you're not going to succeed with the other. And then finally, as we've now alluded to many times, and I've already exceeded my only two rules, they all embraced crises. It's no coincidence that many of these answers came just when things seemed like they were at their absolute worst in these countries. And that's because crises of that magnitude, existential crises, have a way of concentrating the mind. And they can also sweep away many of the institutional and political hurdles that ordinarily block reform. And if a leader is willing to take advantage of them, there's tremendous potential for progress at those moments.
Thank you. With that, I'd love to bring our audience in, and we have a chance to have a couple of questions for Jonathan while he's here. So if you have a chance, please take a quick moment just to ask your question, and we'll move around the room. Yes, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. I wanted to follow up on Indonesia. You mentioned that it's a more pious country and that it's an Islamic majority, but through some other sources, I'm aware that there's actually been a very successful Christian evangelical movement in Indonesia. And what I think maybe is going on, I'm interested in your opinion, is that the Indonesians have figured out a way for several religions to kind of coexist in a positive way. That's the kind of secret sauce. And then, secondly, What are Canadians most proud of? You said multiculturalism too. And hockey's not number one. So what is number one?
Well, I'll answer that first because the answer is even more implausible than multiculturalism. It's the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is Canada's Bill of Rights. It's key constitutional document. Canada, like the UK, doesn't have a written constitution, but it does have the charter, which it passed in the late 80s, of which Canadians like more than the Queen, more than the loonie, and more than hockey. Back to Indonesia. So Indonesia, you're right, is a ethnically and religiously diverse country. As I said, there are 5 major religions. The country, since its founding as an independent country, has always professed to treat those 5 religions on an equal footing. That's often been something that they've done much better on a rhetorical basis than they have in reality. The fact of the matter is the country is 95% Muslim. There are strong Christian communities in some areas. The government has done a decent job in the last 16 years protecting the Christian communities. It's done a very good job of ending religious conflicts on many of the islands. It has done less of a good job at protecting some very small sects like the Ahmadiyas, who are an offshoot of Islam, who are considered heretical by many Sunni Muslims. But at least the 4 Democratic presidents have always spoken very strongly and very openly about the need for religious pluralism. And for that, they deserve enormous credit.
Thank you for coming to Chicago. Here's my question. So how would you apply this to the U.S. administration? Let's say you had an hour with Donald Trump and an hour with Hillary Clinton. How would you take your book and say, okay, these are things for you, both of you, to think about. One of you are going to make it.
Sure. One of those 2 scenarios that you just suggested is easier for me to imagine than the other, because the idea of the current Republican candidate asking for advice from anyone, let alone from other countries, seems a bit hard for me to imagine. Nonetheless, were it to happen, I would say, I would reiterate the 3 core lessons, or 4, or however many I ended up talking about, that I've just articulated. I would emphasize that one of the key takeaways of my book, as cheesy as it sounds, is that there is always hope. In fact, there's often the greatest hope just when things seem that they're worst, and that all of the problems that I describe in the book, and many of, not all of the problems that we are dealing with in this country today, have solutions. The other thing that I would really emphasize is that the United States, in many ways, is, I think, a better candidate for applying these lessons than just about any other country in the world, because as bad as things look in the United States today, they only look bad until you start looking at every other country in the world. And the problems that we have, serious as they are, pale in comparison to what the Europeans are struggling with today, to what China is struggling with today, with what Russia is struggling with today. So I think the potential, if this country can start to make progress and start to tackle these problems, the potential for this country to leap forward again because of our enormous strengths in our education. We have the best universities in the world. In the economy, we have the most innovative industries in the world. We have a very young population, et cetera, et cetera. And the potential is enormous, and because so many of our problems are self-inflicted. These are things that we have done to ourselves. These are not created by external enemies, despite what Donald Trump would argue. These are problems that are not created by natural events. These are problems that we are creating for ourselves by doing things like gerrymandering our political districts and allowing money to play the role that it does in the American polity. And what that says to me is that just like we created these problems, we can undo them as well, although it's going to take a lot of work. And my fear with the United States is that these self-inflicted wounds are making the solutions harder and harder to apply every day. And the longer that we go down the path that we're currently on with a gridlocked Congress, et cetera, and a divided polity, the harder it's going to get to apply these lessons. I hope that's an answer to your question. I realize it's not as specific as it could be, but that's because the problems that we face are sort of idiosyncratic and not exactly the same. And so, we face political gridlock like Mexico did, but our political system is different than Mexico, so we can't simply take what worked there and do it here.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Okay. I'm also a Canadian and an American. I was born there, part of the empire in those days. And I also am a university professor, teaches courses in the area of terrorism. In American intelligence communities, there's been great concern about Canadians' openness because as a terrorist threat. I'm wondering if you could say some words about that.
There's concern. I don't know how much of it comes from the intelligence community and how much of it comes from politicians. What I do know is that this threat has yet to materialize, and that Canada's screening processes are extremely rigorous. Let's take refugees. Refugees have to go through 3 or 4 UN screenings before a host country, even starts its own screening process. And then Canada undertakes a process that is extremely rigorous, which helps explain in part the fact that there has been, I think with 1 or possibly 2 exceptions, there have been no terrorist attacks in Canada since 9/11. And then another thing that Canada has working for it is the success of integration in Canada, which, by the way, is something that the United States still has working for it. And one of the reasons that the threat of homegrown terrorism here is still minuscule compared to Europe, for example. And that's because despite the rhetoric in the current campaign, Muslims have it much better in the United States than they do in Europe. They are integrated into American society in a way that they're not abroad. And so that means 2 things. 1, they have a much greater stake in the country. And 2, they tend to cooperate with the authorities in a way that they don't in France and Belgium and Germany, et cetera.
There was several cases of terrorists coming to the United States from Canada. One was the attempt to bomb LAX. There were several others that originated. In Canada, coming at the United States, but not Canada. The parallel was Germany, which allowed all sorts of groups to accumulate and plot anything they wanted, as long as they didn't plot it against Germany. And of course, that's where the number of the 9/11 bombers came from.
Well, I'm not a counterterrorism expert, but my understanding is, especially since the LAX incident, that Canada has increased its screening, both within Canada and in terms of, and its cooperation with the U.S. intelligence agency, which wasn't very good up until that.
We have a question in the back.
Sir, in your presentation, you talked about the generous policy of immigration in Canada. We were recently in Vancouver, a fantastic modern town. Wasn't there a time when people from Hong Kong had to pay $500,000 to come to Canada?
Yes, the Canadian government has experimented with different immigration programs for high-value migrants, as has the United States, by the way, over the years. It's still the case that if you invest a certain amount of money in an American corporation, in a startup, in a new economic venture in the United States, you can get fast-tracked for immigration purposes. Canada did that, and some Canadians argued did too much of it. And there was a backlash against it in in Vancouver especially, where a huge number of Hong Kong Chinese came in, many of them very wealthy, bought homes, helped or are blamed for driving up the price of real estate in Vancouver, and then went back to Hong Kong with the security of their Canadian passports. And I know that the Canadian government is now trying to do is taking several measures to address that problem. One is to try and ensure that people who apply for immigration to Canada are actually serious about living in the country. And another is to ensure that once they become Canadians, they remain more involved with the country. And then finally, I think the quotas of that particular I forget the name of it. It's something like entrepreneur class, have been dramatically lowered.
Just looking for some more commonalities that help explain the positive outcomes of the case studies. Could you talk about the role of constitutional text? Are there similar features of the constitutions of the different countries, like level of federalism, ease of amendment, or separation of powers that can help explain the breakthroughs in some of the nations?
I haven't thought about that question. It's a very interesting one. My immediate answer is no. There's an enormous diversity of political models represented throughout the book, from some authoritarian regimes to parliamentary democracies to presidential systems. And the countries ran the gambit from Indonesia, which is enormous and has a radically decentralized political system, such that the federal government now controls only a few, an amazingly small number of government policies, and an enormous amount is left to the regions. And then you have a country like Singapore, which is tiny and as centralized as a country can get.
I think I saw one more question over here. Let's take that last question, please.
What did the role of the press have to play in all these different situations? I mean, it seems to me like lack of transparency is one of the things that worked in Mexico. And, you know, we're always talking about transparency, and it just seems like no matter what anybody does, it's being picked apart to death. And
yeah, I have to be careful about how I say this, but yes, confidentiality and secrecy did play initially a very important role in Mexico. The pact has been accused of being anti-democratic for those reasons. But I don't really buy that for the simple reason that, yes, it was negotiated in secret, but then it was announced publicly. And then over the next 2 years, all of these measures had to be passed through Mexico's Congress, where they were subjected to intense public and media scrutiny. I think that the media in many of these cases tended to be a sort of lagging indicator. So rather than a contributor, a positive contributor, it often tended to be, or in some cases at least, was a negative contributor that needed to be brought along. And Canada is the example that I would cite there, where, as I mentioned earlier, late into the 50s and even in the 1960s, you still had the Canadian press campaigning against broad liberalizing of Canada's immigration rules. But once Canadian society started to change, the press eventually came along.
Excellent. So Jonathan, I would like to thank you for, first of all, finding these stories, second of all, putting them in a book, and thirdly, bringing your conversation here to Chicago.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Karen, and thanks to all of you.